weapon. As we go through it, I'll explain different things about the weapon quickly as I can and try to keep it simple. To start out with, this is a 1921 AC Thompson submachine gun. This is one of the weapons of the 15,000 manufactured by Colt Firearms Manufacturing Company in 1921. They made 15,000 guns. This is serial number 7387, which puts it right about in the middle of the production range. It has most late features on it as far as markings on the weapon. It has the Thompson bullet logo of the later production run in there. It also has, it has the 9 patent numbers on it, which is actually a hallmark of the earlier production. They ended up going up to 12 numbers on this side of the receiver. You'll see on the gun it's marked manufactured by Colt's Patent Firearms Manufacturing Company, Hartford, Connecticut. Okay, right here. It was actually made for the Auto Ordnance Company out of New York City, USA. This weapon is called the Thompson because it's the brainchild of General John Thompson. He was a general in ordnance in the U.S. Army. He was directly responsible for the 1911 pistol being adopted, the 1903 Springfield rifle being adopted, the 3006 cartridge, and the building of Eddystone Arsenal in South Philadelphia in Pennsylvania. He left the Army to pursue his dream of making a man-portable weapon that could, as he called it, a trench sweeper or trench broom that could go into the trenches during World War I in Germany and sweep the trenches out. The original prototypes actually had no sights and had no attachment for a butt stock. His concept was that they would go into a trench full of Germans with a 100-round drum magazine on the weapon and just spray them full of bullets. Okay, so this particular weapon that's been brought to my attention was the one used by John Dillinger in the Crown Point, Indiana jailbreak. And this makes this weapon very historically significant. So this is a 1921 AC Thompson. The reason it's an AC is because it has a compensator on there, and that's what the C stands for. All original Colt Thompsons, all 15,000, were manufactured with just a front sight lug and a sight on the end of the weapon. The compensator did not come available until 1926. The Auto Ordnance Corporation purchased a patent from a Marine Corps colonel named Cutts, and that's why it's called the Cutts compensator. This was later copied on other weapons such as the Browning automatic rifle civilian versions. It also became the basis for the Lyman polychoke that was on a lot of shotguns in the 40s and 50s. So anyhow, getting to field stripping the weapon, the first thing we want to do is this gun fires from an open bolt. So we want to remove any source of ammunition. Drum magazine or stick magazine is removed. You want to pull the bolt to the rear and visually inspect the chamber and make sure that is empty. Okay, this weapon fires from an open bolt, which means that as this weapon is right now, it's actually not prepared to fire, even if it had a magazine in it. If you were to fire the weapon, you would cock the actuator to the rear first, squeezing the trigger. We'll show you more detail on that as we strip it. On full auto, the weapon would continue to cycle as long as you held the trigger. On semi-auto, the weapon would fire once. There's a piece in there that resets the sear, and you would only be able to fire one shot at a time. Okay? Now, another thing is before you start disassembling the weapon, you want to make sure the gun is on full auto. You don't want it to be on semi-auto, and I'll show you why in a moment. So we want to let the bolt home safely. Okay? First thing we'll do is push the button at the back here and remove the butt stock straight off the rear. Invert the weapon. And now what you have down here is you have a little spring-loaded frame latch. You can push that in with your finger. At the same time, you want to reach in here around the pistol grip and hold the trigger to the rear, and you can bring the grip frame of the weapon straight off the back. Okay? This, for general purposes, you can clean this with a brush, solvent. I would suggest getting a spray can of gun scrubber and going in there and spraying it out, and then spraying brake free in there to re-lubricate everything. In the event you want to take this weapon down further here, okay, what you have is you have what's called a pivot plate here on the end. You would take a padded screwdriver, hopefully, because this is a priceless weapon. You would go in here and you would pry this. You could put a very thin piece of leather in there with a screwdriver. You want to pry that first spring down. You push out on this stud, and this is what's called your fire control lever. This fire control lever will come out the left side. Your rocker pivot will come out the top. The next thing you want to do is to press this spring and push this button out, and that's your safety lever. That'll also come out the left side of the weapon. Once you have done that, you can take the two studs of your pivot plate and you can push them straight out the right side of the weapon, pull them out, and you can keep finger tension down on the trigger and the sear, and so that they don't fly out, which they shouldn't anyhow. You take the pivot plate out, and then these pieces can come out of the top. They can be separated and they can be thoroughly cleaned and put back in after they're relubricated. It's not necessary to remove the magazine catch under most circumstances, but if you were to remove it, that would be done after everything else was removed. You would simply push it up here to its highest point, push in on the stud on the right side of the trigger frame, and free the spring and the magazine catch from the trigger frame. You have to push it up high enough so that the tip in front here, the catch itself, clears the hole. And that can only be done once this other stuff is moved out of the way, including the pivot plate. With the pivot plate in place, it will only allow the magazine catch to go up just enough so that the stud clears and the magazine can be inserted and removed. So that's your trigger frame. Now, your receiver, all you have to do is, this is a 1921 configuration. You simply push your spring forward, get your buffer and pilot out of the hole, and you bring them out. You can separate the spring, you can separate the buffer and the pilot. Okay? Now you want to lift up the weapon slightly and bring the bolt all the way to the rear. The bolt system and actuator is 3 pieces. Your bolt comes off this way. Okay? If you decide that you want to take the bolt, it's a triangular steel hammer with a pin through it. All you simply have to do is get a punch and drift this pin out either way. The hammer will come out. The firing pin will come back rearward in here because it has a spring in it. You can pull the firing pin and spring out the rear of the bolt. They can all be cleaned and disassembled. To take your extractor out, you take a small screwdriver, you lift the extractor out this way, hook under the beak of the extractor with the screwdriver, and you can then pull it slightly forward. It will disengage from the grooves. You can then take the extractor out. You can clean the extractor well, and you can clean the extractor itself. And that is your bolt. In these Colt guns, bolt was made from a high nickel steel. That's why you'll notice it has no blued finish on it. It's not necessary. Bolt will just continue to stay this way as long as it's properly maintained. It shouldn't rust. Now, at this point, what you have to do to get the bronze H-lock out is go back forward with your actuator. You'll see the H-lock will ride up in the diagonal slots. The H-lock can only go back in one way. However, there is an arrow usually on there that says forward. It's marked. Now, this time, what you have to do is bring your actuator back to the rear. You have to bring the knob of the actuator to the large portion of the top cocking slot. The actuator lifts straight out. This particular configuration is a 1921 model. And why that is originally when Colt produced the weapon, they were all 1921s, all 15,000 of them. They had a cyclic rate of 8,000 rounds per minute. Later on in the 20s, the Auto Ordnance Corporation wanted to sell these weapons to the U.S. Navy. The Marine Corps, the Post Office, the Coast Guard, the FBI were all satisfied with the 1921 configuration, which is the most reliable functioning configuration of the Thompson gun. The Navy wanted the weapon slowed down to 600 rounds per minute. What Auto Ordnance did was they took the 1921 actuator and they welded a solid weight underneath here. They welded and riveted it in. They drilled a pencil-sized hole in the back. They got rid of the heavy recoil spring, the pilot and buffer, and what they did was they came up with a pilot and buffer that were one piece, and the pilot itself, or the buffer itself, was only skinny enough for the spring. The spring was only about the size of a pencil. What this did was it added weight to the reciprocating mass of the bolt. It weakened the spring at the same time, and it slowed down the cycle rate successfully to 600 rounds per minute. All subsequent Thompsons after the Colt production are 1928 configuration as far as their recoil mechanism. All your military Thompsons, and even the early Savage commercial guns that were made in the beginning of World War II. Now, also in here, there's a spring-loaded set of felt oiler pads. It was felt necessary by Auto Ordnance that the mechanism had to be kept oiled, namely the H-lock, the ears here that ride outside and they ride up in the diagonal slots. It proved not to be necessary, but all your 1921 and 1928 Thompson guns will have felt oiler pads in them. These should be removed for cleaning and put back in. The best way to remove these is to just simply go in here with 2 small screwdrivers in these gaps, pry the ends of it together, and then the unit can be lifted straight out of the receiver. Everything can be cleaned and put back in. Another item you shouldn't have to remove, but in case you ever do, is the ejector. Now, the ejector screws into the weapon with dedicated threads, and what that means is that any ejector in any Thompson gun has the threads in the exact same position, and all the pieces end up in the same position every time. It's what they call dedicated threads. To simply get this out, all you need to do is come under here with a very thin screwdriver and lift the back end of the ejector up. It has a detent in the receiver. It's just a hole in the receiver, and there's a little bit of a ball or a tip that's manufactured on the back of this ejector. You simply have to start it loosening up counterclockwise and get it up past the receiver. The first 2 turns, as you come around, you're gonna scratch the receiver. On a gun this valuable, I would stick something in between there, like some really heavy paper or something, so that you don't scratch the gun. Looking at this gun, I can see that this ejector has only been out of this gun probably once or twice. There's 2 very small scratches there, and that's it. Once you get the ejector to screw out, you can clean the hole, you can clean the back of the ejector, you can clean the tip of it. You can reach up into the chamber area with toothbrushes and solvent and clean that out. Your sight is a Lyman adjustable model. All your 1921 guns and your early 1928 A1 World War II guns had this type of sight. Later on, this was done away with and replaced with a piece of stamped sheet metal to simplify the manufacturing process. The Colt guns are the nicest Thompsons made. Their fit and finish is commensurate with probably any sporting arm made on the planet. If you look at the fit of the wood, you'll notice how everything fits with very little gaps and spaces, and everything's even. If you look at the buttstock, you can see the return on the buttstock. Everything is inletted very well. And by the way, coincidentally, we need to tighten these screws up. They're loose. See how your stock arm's getting loose? That's going to end up cracking your stock in recoil. All the wood for the Thompson was made by Remington, and only 2 parts of this gun were subcontracted from Colt. The rear sight was made by the Lyman Corporation in Connecticut, and the wood was made by Remington. That's it. The rest of this gun was manufactured by Colt. So now reassembly. So with reassembly, first thing we want to do is take our actuator, place it back in the large end of the cocking slot, and move our actuator all the way forward. We want to take our bronze H-lock. You'll see it says up here, and there's an arrow. This is a little bit dirty, but you can see the up, you can see the arrow. You want to take, the arrow should always point towards the front. The up means it's facing upward as you're reassembling the weapon. You simply drop your H-lock back into the receiver, push it down. You'll notice everything should travel freely. If you look at the weapon, you see this should travel freely. If this starts getting hung up, you want to take a look. So now you want to bring your actuator all the way to the rear. You then want to take your bolt and lay on top. You want your grooves in the bolt to match the grooves in the H-lock. At this time, you can slide everything forward. Now I'm going to show you something. This is how the weapon fires. When the trigger is pulled and the bolt is released, it goes forward. The triangular hammer strikes the abutment in the receiver as the weapon chambers around. It does this so that the weapon don't fire out of battery. If you notice, as the hammer is pushed in, the H-lock comes all the way up to the top. And what that is, there was a principle. The patent was actually bought from a guy in the Navy named Blish. It's called the Blish lock. He found that heavy artillery guns, that the threads of the breech plug adhered under high pressure, but if they shot low pressure loads in the guns, the breech block tended to back itself out after firing. And it's a principle to deal with adhesions of different metals. It was used in the weapon. It was found later on not to be necessary, especially for the .45 caliber cartridge, but it is it's an iconic piece of American engineering went into this weapon. So when the bolt goes all the way forward, the abutment of the receiver presses the triangular hammer in, and I will show you that at that moment, the hammer is pressed in, the firing pin protrudes from the face of the bolt and fires the cartridge at that moment. So, now all we have to do is we reassemble our buffer and pilot. And this is actually your buffer, and inside this buffer, there's some fiber disc, okay? And what happens is, if you notice, you'll see that the shoulder on the pilot and the shoulder on the buffer do not touch all the way. There is a small gap. That is because the buffer disc, the fiber disc in there, absorbs some of the recoil when the bolt comes all the way back to the rear of the receiver. This is a recoil absorbing measure that was incorporated in this weapon. Okay, so we have our spring, we have our buffer and pilot all set up, and all we simply do is insert the spring in the back of the bolt group. One thing you want to do, you notice there's a flat spot on the buffer. That has to face downward in the receiver. That's so that the buffer will clear the flat of the receiver and go in the hole. If you try to put it the other way, you will not be able to get the pilot to go in the rear hole. Or simply, all we do is put that into place. You can check the mechanism. You want to keep your thumb on the bolt. If you just try to pull back on the actuator, the bolt is going to ride up and everything's going to want to come apart. Keep your thumb on the bolt. Everything should function smoothly. Okay? And you can see that action where when it hits the abutment, it presses the firing pin in. All by spring pressure. Okay? Reassembling the grip frame. You want to make sure the weapon is on fire and full auto. The reason you want it on full auto is if you go to single shot, the rocker pivot will stick up. It will catch the bolt when you try to slide the grip frame forward, and it will jam up. If you try to force it, you will damage either the bolt, more likely you will damage the rocker pivot. Okay, I'm going to show you why the rocker pivot's in there and how it works. This weapon was also built with a magazine hold open device. That does not work on a drum magazine. It does work on the box magazine on a 20-round stick. And this is what happens. You're firing the weapon, so you have the trigger back, the sear is down, the bolt is free to move back and forth. When your magazine goes dry, the follower comes up and it hits this stirrup right here, pushes it up, which disconnects the sear and allows the sear to pop up. So actually what happens is there's not actually a separate hold open device in the trigger frame. You have a device that simply manipulates the sear into coming up, catching the bolt and keeping the bolt to the rear. And as long as that empty magazine is in the weapon, you can pull the trigger all you want. And if you notice, the sear stays up in the back. Bolt remains locked to the rear. Okay? That's one feature of the weapon. Another feature of the weapon is that to achieve semi-automatic fire, this is an open bolt weapon. So what they did was they added a selector lever and a rocker pivot. Now the shaft of this selector lever is on an eccentric. It's not straight. It has a cam and it has an eccentric part to it, a shoulder. When you take and you move your selector to the single shot position, you notice that the rocker pivot rises. See its position here? Look at its position now. This is what happens when you fire the weapon, okay? And the bolt recoils backwards. It rides over this rocker pivot. As it rides over the rocker pivot, it lets the sear come up. So what happens is you're on semi-automatic and you fire the weapon. Bolt goes forward. I'm sorry, the bolt goes forward, not rearward. The bolt goes forward, trips the rocker pivot. The bolt has already gone past the sear, so the bolt fires around. As the bolt comes back into battery and recoils, the sear is up and catches the bolt. So while you're in semi-automatic, you can only fire one shot. It's very important when you reassemble the trigger housing that the beak of this rocker pivot is always oriented towards the rear. You want that oriented towards the rear. If you put this in backwards, what will happen is that I want you to look down in here and you'll see, if you notice, the rocker pivot is not what actually resets the sear. The rocker pivot hits this trip. See that trip? It lets it fall out from under the nose of the sear and lets the sear come back up. If you put this in backwards, this part will be over to this side, clear of the trip. What will happen is you'll just have straight full automatic fire. You will not have semi-automatic fire. So, very important to remember. The way this weapon functions in full auto, of course, is that the bolt is held to the rear by the sear. When you squeeze the trigger, the sear goes down. The bolt is free to continue to cycle back and forth until 1, you run out of ammunition, or 2, you release the trigger. So we're on full auto, we're on fire. All you're simply going to do to put this back on, you're going to lay the grooves of the trigger housing rearward of the grooves of the receiver. You're going to press the trigger housing down. You're going to start to slide it on gently. You do not want to force it. All you should have to do is slide it on. This little spring-loaded latch is your frame latch. That's what holds the frame to the gun and keeps them together. Okay? So, you can now reattach your buttstock. Okay? You can function check the weapon. 1, make sure it's a safe weapon. You have an empty chamber, no source of ammunition in the magazine. Cock the weapon to the rear. You're on full auto. Hold the trigger down. Cycle the bolt a couple times. Make sure the weapon cycles as it should with no interference. Another rule with the Thompson is that when you do go to semi-auto, the bolt has to be in a retracted position. Do not go to semi-auto with the bolt forward. You'll meet resistance, as I'm right there, and you will damage the mechanism. You should only switch to semi-auto when the bolt is retracted. So we'll switch to semi-auto, okay? We'll hold the trigger in, let the bolt forward, cycle the bolt back. Notice it catches even with the trigger in. Do that several times, okay? Now we want to check the safety. We'll put the weapon on safe. Weapon should not fire, okay? Weapon to full auto, safe, weapon will not fire. Okay, so we've covered the disassembly and reassembly of the 1921 Thompson. I'm going to take a minute here and just go over the drum with you. I want to point out just a couple features that make the Colt Thompson so unique. Very fine checkering on the control surfaces. If you notice, the actuator knob has very fine checkering, very fine machine work. If you look at this weapon, you'll notice the absence of any machine marks. World War II Thompsons will have machine marks on the receiver. They'll actually be semicircular patterns from the Blanchard grinder or whatever they use to grind the receiver flats. The lower trigger mechanisms are notorious for having deep marks in them from machining. In World War II, later on in production, they took steps to make the guns cheaper and faster. It was a very expensive gun to produce. This weapon cost $200 in 1921. Okay, I think that's the equivalent to $6,000 or $7,000 today. Okay, to manufacture. This weapon was very expensive. Okay, another thing, if you'll notice, the fire controls on a Colt gun are very finely made and they're checkered. They're very finely checkered, and you notice that the safety control has a chamfered hole drilled through it. You'll not see this stuff on the later World War II guns. Okay, everything's very finely checkered and very finely well made. The Lyman adjustable sight optimistically goes out to 600 yards. And believe it or not, in the military at one time they actually did shoot this gun at long range and try to qualify with it. This is probably a practical gun for 100 to 200 yards. Okay, this sight appears to be jammed up a little bit. It should go down, but there it goes. It needs a little bit of lubrication. That's where the sight should basically be kept at its lowest setting. When the sight is flipped down, you have a V notch and a front blade that you would use. When you flip the sight up, it becomes a peep, an aperture. Okay. So let's talk about the drum. There's many different kinds of drums out there for Thompsons. When a Thompson was originally built by Colt, Colt manufactured 50 round and 100 round drums. They used the Roman numerals to denote all their magazines. They did not call this a 50-shot drum back then. It was called an L drum. L was the Roman numeral for 50. The 100-round drum was called a C drum. The 20-round box magazine was called the double X magazine. That was a Roman numeral for 20. That was the 3 magazines that they made. They made 2 other magazines for the original Colt guns. They made a very rare 18-shot magazine that was intended for 45 caliber bird shot. It was used for riot control. They also made a very rare experimental 25 round magazine, of which hardly any exist. This particular drum that we have here is what's called a New York drum. You'll notice on the back plate here, it has Auto Ordnance Corporation, New York, USA. This drum is very early and very valuable in that it actually has a serial number. The serial number to the back, the drum body, and the front cover match. That makes this a very collectible drum. Okay, the way these drums work. Another thing about this drum I'm going to tell you is that it says wind to 11 clicks. That proves that this is a very early Colt drum made only for the 1921. When the 1928 gun came out with a higher cyclic rate of fire, they began to stamp the drum magazines with down here actually, with a semicircular message that said wind 9 to 11 clicks. If you had a 1928 gun that shot slower, you wound the drum to 9 clicks. If you had a 1921 gun, you still wound it to 11 clicks. To take this drum apart, all you simply do is lift up on the spring latch and slide the winding key off. Okay? You then carefully separate the front of the drum from the body. If you notice, there's the original blued finish. And what makes this, another thing that verifies this is an authentic Colt drum and makes this drum collectible, notice the center rotor is made of nickel steel. It's not blued. Also notice that the center stud is hollow in the middle. These are hallmarks of a Colt manufactured drum. Okay? The way you load this drum is once you have it down to here, you lay your bullets you lay your bullets in the track, okay, with the nose up. This drum will hold 50 rounds. You just simply fill the track. You can see that this drum hasn't been used a great deal, because normally the ones that have been used a lot have round circles all through the track from the bullets being in there. But all you simply do is you fill the track with bullets, okay, all the way around. You get 50 rounds in there. Once you do that, you simply put the face of the drum back on. You then take your winding key, and you'll notice that it has a round hole, a square slot, and a spring has a little catch on it in there. All you want to do is you want to find the grooves in your drum. It can go this way, it can go this way. You find the grooves in your drum, you simply get the slot in the grooves, push it until it clicks in. Your drum is now reassembled, loaded, okay? Now, as far as firing the gun, what you need to do is retract it. To load and unload a drum magazine, it can only be done with the bolt retracted. You'll notice that the frame has these grooves milled in it. These grooves are for the drum magazine to slide in and out. So what you have to do is retract your bolt, put the weapon on safe, okay? As a precaution, you could go to single shot if you want to. In case you do have an accidental misfire, you won't fire a burst. Take your drum magazine. You'll notice that in the back of the drum magazine, there's a notch, okay? That corresponds with the tip on the magazine catch. You simply slide your drum magazine in the grooves, okay? You'll notice as you get in there that the notch on the drum magazine has a fairing or a boss on each side. It's curved. That's so that will automatically push the magazine catch back. You can just slap the drum in there and it catches. You heard it catch. Yeah, we got to tighten them up. Do you have a screwdriver handy? Yeah, they got to be tightened up because you're going to end up. You already got a crack starting right there. See it? Yeah. So, now another thing you'll see sometimes on a Colt stock is that it's probably wore off on this one, but a lot of times there was an anchor symbol pressed into the front of the wood up here. So, here's your 1921 AC, ready to fire. Okay, you would simply take the safety off, fire the weapon. Okay, the bolt's going to go forward, continue to fire until you're empty. When you fire a drum magazine dry, there is no bolt hold open capability. So what will happen on your last shot is you'll fire dry. What you have to do to get rid of the drum, you have to retract the bolt first. The best way to get rid of the drum is to do one of two things. Reach in here and lift the magazine catch up and simply push the magazine out the side, or lift the magazine catch up with your thumb, grab the drum and pull it out the side, and then reload. Okay?